Hello, welcome to Millville, or close there too. We're on Bolidry Island. I'm actually at Hank's farm as opposed to Iking farm. And today we're talking about Jamie Moreira's Development Narratives as Tradition, the case of Nova Scotia agriculture. I really like this article because one of the things it points to is that places have themes associated with them, motifs that are thrust upon them, that they start to inhabit and they start to perpetuate themselves. And one of the things about Cape Breton in general, and something that is something that you might know, or might think rather, about Cape Breton, whether you are from here or whether you have heard it, whether you're not from here and you've heard it through sort of biases or through popular culture or through joke lore or whatever, is this sense of just the ongoing disappointment of development, in that Cape Breton is a place where good ideas can never really get off the ground. And to the point where it's sort of fundamentally a motif. You might even make an argument that it is a type. And when reality happens and businesses do fail, or development schemes don't pan out the way that they were hoped to, it's sort of written off as well, what did you expect? It's happening in Cape Breton. More so when success does happen, when development does work, when individuals, and particularly in the case of these articles, when agricultural products or agricultural businesses like Iking's farms, like Hank's farms, takes off and does well and demonstrates that it is feasible, in a way that's erased, or it's considered the exception. Certainly within the vernacular lore. Now, obviously, there will be things like Better Business Bureaus, and they'll have Businessmen of the Year, and Iking was our Member of Parliament for a number of years. And so, status can be accorded, and yet the motif still exists and is still retained. And so much of it has to do with the ongoing theme of Cape Breton in terms of that tension, that insider-outsider tension, and how Cape Bretoners imagine that they are potentially perceived, and often the way that they imagine they are perceived is validated because they get that perception mirrored back at them. It's like, oh, we really are thought of this way, and then a cycle can continue. But it also has to do with that public and private. And so it's like the narratives that Cape Bretoners tell the world about can-do, about stick-to-itiveness, about ingenuity, about entrepreneurship. And then in the private realms, sort of behind closed doors, the sort of narrative of like, oh, it's Cape Breton, what are you going to expect? And then again, perpetuating that aspect. But also sometimes it's the what could you expect because we weren't being properly supported, and then it can also feed into the narratives of off-island ownership, off-island governance, off-island power, that, well, new industries, new initiatives never really had a chance because we will never be the masters of our own destiny as long as, and then fill in the blank, as long as we're not our own province, as long as the equalization formula is fundamentally unfair, as long as we don't have a causeway. And then we had a causeway, and it's like, well, as long as the causeway's there and driving people around. So they become a perspective on place that has genuine ramifications, including such things as indeterminate future. Indeterminate future for in-migration, indeterminate future for population staying, and an indeterminate future for whether or not the rest of the population will leave. So he calls these narratives of failed development, an embedded feature of cultural discourse in Atlantic Canada. He's making the argument that they are traditional. And we want to sort of recognize that when we are talking about narratives, we're not necessarily talking about fixed, focused things that you and I might recognize as story that might get collected in a book of narratives of, the stories from Atlantic Canada. It's much more the narratives that comprise oral history, the narratives that are about place, that are ascribing narrative characteristics, the kind of things that we look for in a good story in terms of characterization, but also in terms of motive, and perhaps also in terms of recurrent themes of fate and fatalism. And so they are traditional in as much as these new stories emerge, they're tapping into the level of the motif, the motif really of failed development. So he says, in broad stroke, these development narratives, may be called traditional only in the general sense that they have a cultural presence that is both deep-rooted and pervasive. The same narrative, the same type, specific type, isn't going to be told and retold. Well, that's not 100% true, because you might hear the same story of a botched development, which might enter into anecdote and joke lore. But for the most part, it also allows for the generation of new narratives, or rather the generation of new explanations that take the form of narrative and meet our criteria for what comprises a good narrative. And one of those themes is it fits into our general sense of place because it's about failed development. Despite the fact that there is actual development that can happen. As I said, it's really only the failures are considered par for the course, and the successes are considered anomalies, and therefore really don't enter into the narrative discourse. And then some of this is some of his articles are sort of packed with history, and some really interesting history, like where he provides these explanations that actually rationalize why some things have happened, certainly in comparison to other regions. For example, there were once many, many small farms on Bolidree and in industrial Cape Breton region, the eastern part of the island. Well, all over the island, but his field work is basically around Millville and let's say within 45 minutes of downtown Sydney. And there once were many farms, and most of them have ceased production. And a simple explanation, the traditional explanation, is that you couldn't make a go of them. Because what? Landscape? Maybe it's a rugged landscape narrative. Maybe more to the point, it's not part of the Cape Breton character, or maybe it's just luck. The place is cursed somehow. Various explanations. The rational explanation, the real explanation, is that when you're comparing it to other places, many, many other places within Canada, even Ontario is the counterexample he gives, their farms were able to be sustained because there was a larger secondary employment opportunity for farmers. So if you could have 50% of your income coming from the farm, but 50% of your income coming from some form of industry, light industry or regional development there, then it was really that salary that was helping to subsidize the farm. When if you didn't have that secondary infrastructure in Cape Breton and you're just relying on farms, then the farms become unfeasible. Farming is largely on the small scale that we once saw. The traditional scale of farming is largely, not exclusively of course, but largely non-feasible if that is your sole source of income. And so when the opportunities weren't present in Cape Breton as they were elsewhere, the Cape Breton farms start to close and they become consolidated. But that doesn't fit in with the narrative. It doesn't fit in, and it could, because it could be talking about the failure of local governance to develop this secondary base. But that's too complex an idea to fit into a nice, simple, explanatory device like sort of just the standard failed development narrative. The second has to do with as farming becomes more and more technologically based, as it becomes more and more regulated for good reasons. Things like you need better storage for milk because you want to reach this particular standard. It isn't a bad thing in and of itself, but it requires a level of investment that local farmers say, can I do this or can I not? And if they can stay in the industry, and if they can't, then they're going to fold. So these little nexuses, these moments, on page 289 he puts it in this. Rather than natural, gradual attrition, the more familiar story points to critical junctures created by policy initiatives that force a decision on whether or not to continue, and if one decides to carry on, significant capitalization is required. It is axiomatic, however, that investment decisions require confidence, and behind agricultural development in the region, the prevailing narrative is one of, at best, equivocal success. So at these moments, when the individual farmer is deciding whether or not to double down, to invest in new equipment, they actually become influenced by that narrative tradition themselves about, like, well, this is now investment for myself, this is now development, and what do we know about development in the region? Development is doomed to failure. So that becomes an influence that is embedded. It becomes internalized, which becomes a hindrance to certain forms of investment and development. So Jamie introduces, again, a fair amount of history in terms of the ongoing development of agriculture in Nova Scotia in general, not simply in Cape Breton. And he talks about the rise of the agricultural movement, where that guy Agricola started writing in the local newspapers, for whom Agricola Street in Halifax is actually named, and was basically trying to introduce the science of contemporary agriculture to Nova Scotia. And but there were economic crises that were caused by basically the period after the American Revolution, and then the period immediately following the Napoleonic Wars. So there was this economic dismay, which was driving prices down, and it's kind of fascinating that the answer is always to modernize, but modernization is fine as long as one has a product to sell at the end, but not too much product to sell. So all this effort was being put into modernization and improving yield, which was really critically important in Europe at the time, because industrialization was taking over, land was decreasing, the population was booming. Not decreasing, sorry. Population was booming, and they needed to get more out of the land. Then they bring that material over to Nova Scotia, and that's wonderful. They're able to produce more, but they don't have the population to sustain it as a market. So prices drop, food goes rotten, and it's like we're actually making too much. Our things are fine, but you already have at that time the understanding that what these people need is someone from out of town to tell them what to do. And then it gets tied into government policy, and at which point you can really start pointing to the quote-unquote experts. And I'm using quote-unquote because I'm okay with experts, given what I do for a living. But the theme of the person from out of town who doesn't understand the basic things. And there's that wonderful example of the sort of the experimental farm at Edwardsville, where they're trying with different breeds. And it's like, why would you bring a breed that is designed for a completely different landscape to Cape Breton? These people didn't do the work. And then when their project fails, the failure is not accorded to them not doing the research. The failure is accorded to, that's the natural state, the doomed lot that is Cape Breton. And so it feeds in itself that way. He points out that the theme can even be gleaned in things like the stories of Alistair MacLeod. It's endemic within high literary culture, as well as vernacular culture, as well as just sort of the common parlance of the day. A good place to end, a good place to wrap this up, because it's a fairly I mean, as I said, he's providing a lot of context, so that's available when you read his work. But the point he's bringing up is sort of best exemplified in this interview he did with Bob Richards, the one that he more or less closes the chapter with. But getting back to your broad question of sustainable agriculture, I started here in layman's language with nothing but the ass out of my pants, and I've survived for 20 years. So that says sustainable. But once again, then, we get back to the other human question. You see, the farm that my granduncles were farming is not being farmed. It hasn't been farmed for 20 years, and it was left on a platter to my cousin, you see. This is the way it goes. Agriculture is mainly sustainable if the right people have the amount of commitment it takes. Now, I'll put a challenge to you. You're driving the country. If you will observe, you'll go and you'll see farms that are not being farmed, and then within a mile or 2 miles, you may see a farm that is thriving. It has all the appearance of thriving, but when you take a serious look at it, maybe the land is not quite as good as that one down the road that is growing up. So, this is not agriculture. This is people. And here's where we're coming from. And that's the same as my farm. My farm is not sustaining. No farm is sustaining. It's the level of commitment of the people that are on the farm that's going to make the difference. So Jamie ends by saying how narratives of development are fundamental genre. That when people gather together, when they talk about their present, when they talk about the immediate past, and they talk about the potential future, the idea of failed development as fundamentally an inevitability, as a feature of that's almost built into the landscape, that this land was, on the agricultural level, that this island was not really designed by whoever to sustain an industry. It doesn't really matter how true that is as a belief. It becomes this motivating belief. It becomes this topic of conversation and this sense of place. And this sense of place, this topic, it's not defined by ethnicity. It's not defined by socioeconomic circumstances. You can make an argument that it's defined by industry, that it's basically a piece of occupational lore. But clearly, even though it's very present among the agribusiness and the small farming business, it's pervasive. You will hear this attitude expressed as a critique in newspapers when government projects fail, or new investments seem to tank, or a golf course closes, or the new mine in Donkin closes. It's like, well, what do you expect? And when the government initiatives are seen just as pork products, as pork barrel politics for investments, it's like, why would they do that? They're throwing their money away by putting it here. Oh, sure, we all get jobs for a little while. And it becomes this ongoing and rather insidious theme. But thinking of them as fundamental genres, these are the stories that people tell about place. And this is what gets me, what I really like about Jamie's piece, is this notion of thinking of it as a genre, an informing sense, almost to the point of like mythos, in that it's a tenet, it's a fundamental belief stance that is so ingrained in the sense of place, and again, the insider's sense of place, but also projected from outside. And so it's a private genre, as it were, that leaks out occasionally into things like letters to the newspaper, and then when someone else claims it, it's when an outsider who doesn't have the right to say that story starts to suggest it, it is actually buttressed and fought against and pushed back on. But it's fundamentally informing, and it's interesting to see how that can be overturned, because otherwise you get a population locally, and then you get a perception of this population outside that's fundamentally cynical, that actually starts to make that belief manifest. It starts to adversely affect the possibility of development, because its failure is seen as a foregone conclusion. And I think that's just kind of it's not a happy article, but it's interesting to just take that one step back and think about what you think about Cape Breton when you're not in its celebratory mood. Because you can think wonderful things, and you can also think critical and critiquing and despairing and harsh things. And it's like, all right, well, how much of that is actually really only sustained by a narrative tradition that holds that as a motif? And can the story of place and the reality of place be disentangled sufficiently that the story doesn't actually get manifested in reality? Yeah, that's what I'm going to say. I think I am being attacked by horseflies or something. I come to the country, I like the view, I don't understand the country does not like me very much. So, I'm going to end this now. As ever, I have been Ian, your humble servant, and I have just been talking you through James Moreira's Development Narratives as Tradition, the case of Nova Scotian agriculture. As always, as ever, I wish you well. Pax.